So welcome, COM 2250 class. So I'm Professor Mattison. I'm going to introduce myself, although you already know me for the sake of the video. With us today, we have Julie Sloan. So Julie mixes sound for live theater on Broadway. And she was the original production engineer on Jersey Boys and has opened several shows, including Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Gloria Estefan's On Your Feet, Dessa Rose, and revivals of Jesus Christ Superstar and Guys and Dolls. And before, hello, Professor Quick. And before coming to New York, she toured with the first national companies of Hairspray, Aida, and Annie Get Your Gun. And she holds a degree in audio technology from Indiana University. So please join me in welcoming Julie Sloan to the stage today.
Hello.
So Julia, just to get us started off, could you just tell us a little bit about the path that led you to Indiana and how you kind of found your way into audio production?
Yes, I took a brief tour of your facilities here before we started, and it actually brought back a lot of things that are so ingrained in me that I don't think about them consciously. But when I was in high school, we had a it was a career center that was sort of attached to my high school, and you could take 3-hour vocational classes. They had a lot of offerings, but I did radio TV, and we had much less awesome facilities than what you have here, but we did have a non-commercial station that the students ran, and we did a lot of TV work and stuff like that. And that, combined with stage crew, is where I first started to get interested in the technical side of theater and music. My mom made me play piano when I was a little kid, and then she relented and let me start taking guitar lessons when I was about 12. So that's sort of how I came into all of this. I started off college-wise wanting to be a music major, and I went in as a guitar major. And I went to Butler University first. I ended up dropping out after about a year and a half. And then I waited tables for about 3 years, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I decided that I didn't want to wait tables, and I went back to school, again, as a guitar major. But at IU, they had a program that was, the program I went for was called a BS and an outside field. So you were getting a Bachelor of Science in Music, and then you could pick anything at all for the outside field. But they had this audio program that at the time was in its infancy, and it had sort of two paths. They had like a classical recording path, and they had like a multi-track kind of rock and roll sort of path, which was what I was interested in. And you could do both of these things simultaneously. And it was very competitive to get into it. I got accepted into it. There were small classes, lots of hands-on stuff, and I really enjoyed that. Oh, and then I had when we were talking about something like this earlier, I had an accident with a pocket knife on a gig where I cut through these two tendons, which completely stopped my guitar playing for like 6 months while I got it fixed and healed and all that stuff. And it turned out to be a really good thing because there's really not a very good guitar player. And I was way better at doing sound. And I'm glad that I had that realization before I had like a mortgage and all that stuff to take care of. So it worked out. Does that answer you?
So the two paths that they had at Indiana, so the classical recording, were they introducing you to like microphone selection for an orchestra, and then how did that, or what differentiated between the skills that they were trying to impart to you in the kind of the rock track or this classical track?
Well, it's interesting. The two paths stayed mostly the same for about the first year and a half. And we had the fundamentals classes. We had, an intro to audio and intro to electronics, and everybody was in those classes together. It was a heavy like theory and electronics focus, which has really served me well in my career. So we learned about, microphones together and what applications they would be good for. And because it was part of the School of Music and not part of the theater department, you had ensemble requirements, music theory requirements, and piano proficiency requirements. And because we were audio kids for ensemble, they counted crew. So we did crew hours instead of playing in an orchestra. And what that meant was that we were recording for archive purposes every single event that happened in the School of Music. So the more classical recording stuff, you would have a stereo pair in this hall, and you might want to close mic somebody for a cello solo. Then when the jazz band played, it was full-on PA. You mic'd everybody, and that was in a different facility. So we were getting exposure to different avenues before the paths really split. And then about a year and a half into it, it split, and the focus was more on practical lab time, studio time, what you recorded. And the multi-track kids went to the multi-track studio, and the stereo classical kids went and did other things more specific to that branch.
So then how did you make a transition from more of a music performance recording orientation to like more of a theater based?
This goes back to waiting tables. So when I went back to school, I was kind of a non-traditional student, but I wasn't really old enough to be a non-traditional student. Like there are some people that, they come back to school or they start school when they're in their, say, mid-20s, and I was like 22 and a half. I was paying for it all myself, and I was waiting tables. And once I got accepted into the audio program, little opportunities to make a little money doing sound started to come up. I started doing, I worked at an all-ages club and did sound for the bands that came in there, and somebody would pay you to record their recital. Or my professor had a PA company, and he did PA for weird things, like little board meetings that would happen around campus. Or I think my weirdest day was I did the PA for a tree planting ceremony that the Dalai Lama did in the morning, and then I was mixing a Battle of the Bands contest at a bar at night. So that, I don't remember how I got off on this tangent, but but that's sort of how it happened. I had to pay for college, and the opportunities that were coming were live sound opportunities. And I started to feel where I fit more in those places. I was just very comfortable doing live sound as opposed to studio work. I tend to mix myself into a corner in the studio. There's a skill at knowing when to stop when you have the finished product. And I'm not very good at recognizing that in the studio. Mm-hmm. And what I like about live is that, you do it and it's gone. And, you experience it and it's out there. And then the next day it's different.
It's funny because I do find that, from an audio perspective, there's some people who they're drawn to live for the kind of dynamic thing that live is. Like for myself, I can't stand live because I don't have the control that I want to have. There's like a certain amount as much as you try to rein it in, there's always going to be something that it's just like, you're not going to control how loud that bass is or how, it's just like it's not the perfect bass drum sound, and it's going to be a little boomy today, especially when bands are coming in and out, and if you're traveling around to different clubs and stuff, mm-hmm. It's that inherent lack of control drives me a little batty.
I can see that, and I find very few people that can go into both areas of it. I think Scott Lair is one of the few exceptions. He's a Broadway sound designer who's also an incredible studio engineer, and all of his products are so good, and he's one of the few people that I know that can do that. It's a very difficult thing, and like you said, people are drawn to one or the other usually.
Yeah. So how is it that you come from kind of these freelance gigs that you're doing around? It still sounds like, maybe you've got roots in a club, you're doing this kind of live sound thing, but you're taking side work, even kind of corporate-y kind of gigs, it sounds like. So at what point does theater kind of make an introduction for you?
The very first time it made an introduction, I wasn't really aware that it was a whole separate thing. It was a total freelance gig. The worst sound guy in town where I lived needed somebody to cover a gig for him, and it happened to be a community production of Little Shop of Horrors. And when I look back on it now, when I realized that he brought me in cold for 2 performances to cover that, I'm like, God, I would never do that to somebody. That's just awful. But I did it, and I really liked it, and they were really happy with me. But I didn't think much about it until we had to do an internship to finish our degree. And truly the reason that I picked theater was because it was the only place where anybody would pay you anything. Like, none of the studios were paying for internships. and not like they were paying a lot. It was like $500 a month, I think. And I went to Dallas Theater Center for the internship. And that's when things really started to click for me. Not so much in Dallas, because we were doing straight plays, which we can get into later, but because I got stolen away from there by Arizona Theater Company to come mix their musical, which sounded more interesting, and they were paying a whole $8.50 an hour. So I went to that, and that's when I was like, oh, this is fantastic. I'm good at this, and it's fun, and you know, I can make money at it.
So, just introduce us to a little bit to kind of the skills that you got while you were at school. What do you felt was introduced to you either in school or that you kind of developed early on that ended up serving you so that when these opportunities arose, you felt like you were able to kind of capitalize on them?
I think first of all, if you're interested in sound in any capacity, it helps to have exposure to music. And I think that there are, if you're interested in pursuing sound for music, you absolutely need to have a language. You know, you need to be able to talk to the musicians and all of that. It's perhaps less important if you're going into more of a broadcast area, but that, you know, those piano proficiency classes that I sat through and the music theory classes, they actually have served me really well. You need to be able to have conversations with people, even if you're the most socially awkward, introverted, geeky person, which is what I was. You still need to be able to have conversations with people, because your attitude is actually the single most important thing as far as the job opportunities that get presented to you. I can see that now. I wasn't aware of that at the time. The fact that our program was so focused on physics and electronics was huge. Professor Mattison was telling me earlier that one of the things he does for you guys is he talks about signal flow, he talks about gain structure, he has you do field recordings, and then you can dissect them and see, you know, what mistakes were made. I can't tell you how useful that is. In the digital world that we are in right now, I run into so many people that have come out of schools that have never laid hands on analog gear that don't know what gain structure is. They don't know how signal flow works. They can't troubleshoot a problem, and they can't hear when there is a problem. And that's a problem. It's truly a problem. So I think that at IU, those foundational classes of, you know, the physics and electronics, not that you have to sit down and do the math on it, but can you follow the chain? Can you follow the path? Can you hear what's happening, and can you fix the problems that you're hearing? Can you make it sound better?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we were stressing was, you know, kind of at this stage of the game, recognizing that clean audio is your first priority. So just understanding, you know, so what is it that corrupts an audio file? Is it through user error? Is it through environmental problems? You know, so one, being able to recognize when your audio has become compromised by one of these things, and then two, analyzing that enough to know where were those problems introduced so that you can look. Sometimes you can control it. I mean, in a live situation, sometimes you know, you aren't going to have the opportunity to isolate things. But I would imagine, you know, as you start to get into a more full-blown production, I mean, one of the reasons that we have like the rehearsals and the tech run-throughs and all these kind of things is so that come day of, there's really less surprises. I won't say no surprises. So, and I want this to be a discussion amongst you all too. So you had a little bit of time to think about this. So I wanted to just kind of, you know, jumpstart the conversation with Julie, but I'd also like you all to chime in. So if a question occurs to you, please, by all means, feel free to pipe up. So you start to do some of these internships. Maybe there's an inclination that maybe this is something that you could actually make a living in, or that you have like a talent for. And is it just one of those kind of things where it just kind of grew organically, like kind of one opportunity led to the next?
Yeah, it really is like that. I imagine that most jobs work that way. I don't really know because I've not really done anything else except waiting tables, which does work that way. But one gig always leads to the next. And it's so important to remember that you just can't be a jerk to people because you're going to run into these people again. Sometimes you think that you won't, and they always show up again, even if you're touring. I've met people all over the country, and I'll run into them again like 12 years later and be like, oh my God, I'm glad I wasn't a jerk to him. But yeah, one thing leads to the next. And when I ended up out in Arizona, I approached, my work as much as I did in college. It was just what gigs can I get? And I explored some different opportunities. So I was still doing on maybe a slightly higher level the same, do corporate stuff one day. I might do systems tech another day. I linked up with a sound shop out there. And then when the musicals came up, I did the musicals, and it was just sort of all over the place.
So Broadway are union gigs, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk about at what point, joining a union or getting involved with the union kind of played in?
Yeah, I sure can. Okay, unions are confusing, and they're different everywhere. And when I was at IU, we had a roadhouse, and a roadhouse is a theater where touring shows will come in and play. So we had a roadhouse that would get we wouldn't get the first year of a musical, we would get the third or fourth year that it was out touring. And because Bloomington was a small place, they would fill their overhire list with students. So I went and I introduced myself to the BA. My professor gave me a recommendation, and I got a couple of calls. And at that time, working on a union call there was mostly pushing boxes. We mostly didn't know what we were doing with students, and we did whatever they told us to. And we made more money than we ever had in our lives. It was amazing, and it was probably $7 an hour or something like that. So that was the first exposure that I had to it, and. I remember my professor saying to me at the time in no uncertain terms, he's like, if you want to join the IA, you got to do it somewhere else. They're never going to bring you in here because you're a woman. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah. And I think to this day, they still have very, very few female members in that local. It's not that way everywhere. So when I got out to Arizona, my mentality was really treating the union as another opportunity for more work. And I applied for membership and got on their overhire list and started, taking calls and stuff. Most places, the way, and I'm just dropping the term the union, but it stands for the International Alliance of Stage and Theatrical Employees. That's the main union that theater workers work under. And then there are other divisions of it. There's a film and TV version of that. There's a wardrobe version of that. There's an usher version of that. There's just a lot of different variations of that. But when I refer to union, I'm referring to the IA. So you can take calls without being a member, and they usually take dues off the top of that. And then you can apply for membership, and usually you come in as an apprentice, and you have to apprentice for a couple of years, something like that. Then what happened for me is while I was apprenticing, I got an offer to go out on a full paint contract tour. The paint contract is, like the Hamilton tour that's out right now is a full paint contract. Most of the shows that you have heard of on Broadway when they go out the first time, they're a full paint contract. And that means that they bring all of the road crew with them. The paint contract is actually written on a pink piece of paper, and it spells out everything, all of your, all the minimums, what you get paid, what you get overtime for, what the benefits are, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't know what any of that meant when I got the offer. I just knew that I wanted to go on the road. And truly that was it. And they made an exception for me to go out on the road as an apprentice, because you're not supposed to do that. I'm not really sure why, but yeah.
So when you're talking about deciding to join a local, so you got a vibe that maybe the local wasn't as welcoming in the first locale. So how does it actually? How would that actually work? So you mentioned you went to Arizona. Did you hear that there was maybe opportunities in Arizona, or was that closer to home? You know, what kind of led you to Arizona? And then, like when you put in for a union gig, how does that work? Does somebody who's in the union kind of sponsor you, or agree to be like a mentor, or you know, 'cause different unions work it different ways. So.
Yeah. Back to unions are weird and they're a little different everywhere. So I ended up at Arizona because the Arizona Theater Company had pulled me out of my internship at the Dallas Theater Center. And it was just sort of where I ended up. And I pursued that as, you know, an opportunity for more gigs. And I think that pretty much everywhere in the country, there's going to be an IA local, and you can find them online and go down and talk to the BA stands for the business agent, but you can talk to whoever's listed and go in and introduce yourself and ask them. I always go back to direct communication. Just ask somebody, how can I get on your overhire list? You know, are you currently accepting new members? And kind of leave it at that, because one thing definitely leads to the next. And this is, again, where you need to be able to speak to people. Like, unions are it's very much who you know. And it sounds terrible when I say that, but people can speak up in your absence and people can recommend you for work. Like for instance, until tomorrow, I've actually been unemployed for like 6 weeks. And the head electrician at the theater where Jersey Boys was, because I know him, he put me on the load-in for Mean Girls here and there. So I wasn't actually unemployed. I got to go do the load-in, and he hired me because he knew me. I'm not actually a member of his local. I'm a member of the Phoenix local, not the New York local. As I said, they're confusing, but so.
Yeah, anybody? Yeah, Isaiah.
Going to the technical side of things, like from show to show, how do you figure out what mics are? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So we're recording, so we got to make sure we get on.
All right. Is it on?
It's on. That's more for the sake of the recording than it is for the house. So.
Okay. So for the technical side of things, going from show to show, how do you figure out what mics you're going to use? Or let's say for like Hamilton, where it's all singing, how do you, I guess, mix that where it's song after song after song?
That's a really good question. It has a lot of branches. Okay, so there are a lot of different jobs that you can get in theater sound. And the top of it is the sound designer. And the sound designer is the one who picks the microphones. There are associate sound designers. There are assistant sound designers. There are people that come in and help out. And then there's, I'm called the A1. There's an A2 backstage. And then you have a crew of people that are helping you put the show in and also build it in the shop. The sound designer does the entire system spec. They specify, how they want the speakers laid out, which speakers they want, which microphones they want, all of this. And they put together a package that they then send out to bid to all of the shops in the area. There are really only 3 in the area. There's Mask, Sound Associates, and PRG. And they will return bids. Somebody will get awarded the bid. And then you go in and build the show. Typically, we use in musicals, this is changing. We've historically always used Sennheiser transmitters and either Sennheiser or DPA microphones, similar to this but smaller, and we mount them in their hair. We try to hide them as much as possible, and the reason for that is because, as you can tell when I go down like that and the sound changes, you don't want that in a musical. You want it to stay the same constantly so that it's, on their head. You may have also seen shows where they have the boom mics. Sometimes we do that too. I did a production of Jesus Christ Superstar where they had the boom mics. Just depends on the style. The director has a great deal of input in what they want to see on the stage. Some directors say, this is a period piece. I want you to hide all of the elements as much as possible. Okay, so how are you going to get your line arrays up there now? Now you have to work with the scenic designer to figure out where those are going to fit. So, really, sound design is a huge collaboration. Even though you've got one person making the main decisions, they have to work with all of the other departments and the ultimate authority, who is the director, to make it all happen. Then, my job, the mixing part of it. So everybody is on a microphone or possibly two. If they're really important and they don't leave the stage, we double mic them. As I was telling you before, we never turn our packs off. It terrifies me to see a microphone that's off. It's like, why is it off?
Is that partially because of just trying to squat on frequencies and kind of claim them? So like this is my wireless band, and another theater wouldn't end up stealing your frequencies, or is it just?
Well, believe it or not, we're all really well coordinated. It's when I look at the number of frequencies that we're sharing in a tight space in Times Square, it's kind of miraculous. But all of the shops, there's an RF tech who coordinates a show's frequencies, and they then coordinate them with the other shows that are around there, and we're very, very tight. Now, when I was at Jersey Boys and Roseland Ballroom was behind us, we got stomped on all the time because you get rock and roll shows in there that are in for one night, and they probably don't care, but they don't have time. They just simply don't have time. But no, the not turning it off is more about the mixer is in control of when those mics are off and on, and having them always on in the pack removes a major variable there. Because God forbid that you have your actor in control of turning that pack off and on. Like, you don't want that.
So do you just tape over the controls, or they?
We usually pack it up in a little thing that goes into their belt or wherever they wear it. It's built into their costume in some fashion, and they really don't have a lot of access to it. Mm-hmm. They don't want a lot of access to it. They've got enough other stuff going on.
Right.
So, but yeah, so when I say that we mix line by line. And that's the weird little niche thing that I found out that I'm good at. Did I start off to do that? No, absolutely not. That's weird. Why would anybody do that? But that's what we do. You need to mix line by line, and then you're also doing band moves and hitting sound effects and all that jazz.
So how much of that with digital consoles, how much are you kind of going scene to scene, and how much is you actually live following the action?
It's both. I think that digital has done a couple of things. It's made a lot of things easier. Before we had digital, we had digitally controlled analog, which was the sort of the Cadac beast, which I'll show you later. So the idea of you have a center section of VCAs. And what gets assigned to those VCAs, you change every time you take a cue. And that's what I do, is program when to take those cues, who shows up on what fader. And so what happens in the cue, that's automated. So if you need, say you're doing Hamilton and you need to route a vocal off stage, like the guy's off stage and you want it to sound like he's off stage, but you still need to hear what he says. So you do a routing thing in this cue. That's automated. You're not having to go route because you would never get it in time. And then, but you actually bringing the microphone up, that's manual. So there's a huge, both parts of it have to work. Mm-hmm.
So they leave kind of a live element just because of the potential of, somebody's a little late hitting their cue or somebody's responding to something. How much latitude is there within that live performance, I guess?
Yeah, well, that part really depends on the show, but I think, in my experience, the performers that are drawn to live theater, that stay in live theater, are really about the live part of it. And even if they don't have a lot of latitude to improv, they're very much getting, they're having moments with people on stage and with the audience and all that, and it's not always the same. There are a huge number of variables happening. Understudies go on and sub-musicians come in and all of that. So there's a lot of talk about what we could possibly automate, but I don't think you could ever get rid of, the person throwing the faders out there. Mm-hmm. I really don't see that happening.
That kind of leads me to Another question: what are some of the problems you face doing theater, like the environmental and not picking up, let's say, another actor's feedback or something?
That's a very good question, too. It's tough because these microphones that we're using, we use usually omnidirectional mics. So you got this little dinky diaphragm that's omnidirectional, and theater's kind of the worst of all possible worlds for live mixing because they're singing and they're dancing and they got wigs on and they're changing their clothes and they're moving scenery and they're coming up in other people's faces and all that. And I fix that. My designer does what he can at the beginning to minimize things. You know, when we're in tech rehearsals and somebody's singing face to face into a giant metallic tree, we say, hey, can you turn your head out a little bit, please? Because that's really not going to work for us. But you change the way that you mix things. You always end up with a show where you've got a love ballad and people are singing right in each other's faces. There's a huge amount of comb filtering for that. You'll know it when you hear it. It's the patterns just blend in a really terrible way and it doesn't sound anything remotely natural. So sometimes it's better if you put her mic up only. Sometimes it's better if you put his mic up only. Sometimes you want to put them both together at a lower level. Depends on the system. My main sound designer that I've worked for, Steve Kennedy, did what's called an A-B system for a lot of years, which is where everywhere you have a speaker, you have two speakers. And you would route cue by cue, depending on how it mattered. Somebody would go through A and somebody would go through B, and that would eliminate the comb filtering, which was great. But then we got line arrays. And now you don't have the real estate to hang an A-B line array most times. Mm-hmm. Some shows did it, mm-hmm. but that's like a massive amount of real estate that you're fighting for in theater.
Yeah.
So.
That's really cool. Yeah, Tara.
Do you have any like general tips for very new beginners working with multiple lines in a live environment or?
Very general tips. I would go back to the importance of knowing signal flow and gain structure and just really taking the time to listen to things and making sure that you have clear audio, clean audio. I'm constantly running into people that don't have that sort of foundation, and they're jumping ahead to going into, you know, tweaking EQs and adding in effects and things like that, when if your sound isn't good to start off with, you're just going to create more problems for yourself later. That's my first main thing, and the other one is don't be afraid to ask for help. When I first started doing all of this, you know, when I was working in clubs and working with my professor and stuff, I had a hard time, you know, saying that I didn't know something, but how would I know it because I hadn't done it yet? And I had to get over it pretty quickly because at some point it's going to be down to you to make it happen. And so ask the questions while you can.
Some other questions? Lester? Come on, Joe, you're supposed to be walking that mic around. You're getting lazy, man.
First and foremost, I really appreciate your story and your background. I'm in very much a similar position because I'm 25 and decided to come back to school. And I studied audio prior, and I did a lot of like studio recording, and I do live sound on the side, freelance recording, and I do AV. So I totally understand where some days I'm recording someone's EP, but earlier that day I'm doing a corporate meeting at like the Residence Inn in Manhattan. But in regards to that, what is a good way, or in regards to joining a union for doing sound somewhere? I understand that you like to be more direct, as do I, but is there anything in particular, certain tips that you know of that, like what they would look for in a potential overhire?
Yeah, actually, because, you know, I mentioned before that the house electrician brought me in on the Mean Girls load-in. What that looks like is pushing boxes and pulling cable and lifting speakers. It's manual labor. And when I was in college, I actually started lifting weights because I was about as weak as a kitten, and I couldn't lift these speakers up even with help. You know, and I do a lot more of it now just to be able to hold my own when I'm in there. So the first thing is to not be afraid of the manual labor aspect. Actually, the first thing is to show up on time and sober. That's actually a really big deal. You'd be surprised. You know, in general, the people that I have met are looking for people who will be on time and sober, not afraid to work hard, able to keep their mouths shut and not offer their opinion on absolutely everything, and just say yes and do the thing, whatever the thing is. In my experience, that's the best way to make a good first impression on union gigs. I've seen a lot of people do the opposite and come out the worse for it.
There's a time and a place to render your opinion. Like,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you may get the chance later, you know, but yeah, I mean, if you could ever hear us all when we're in the ceiling away from everybody, when we're like pulling up cluster cable, like, what are these guys doing? But you can't, you know, you don't want to like,
Just not
yes. You got to like rein yourself in.
I think it's good advice too, even beyond, you know, you're entering into a creative side of things. So I can't tell you how many ridiculously talented musicians I know who are outstanding players, but their attitude has kept them from getting callbacks. So it's not only, you've got to be outstanding, but you also have to appreciate the environment that you're in, especially when it comes to musicians. A lot of times, like a musician for hire, it's like, you know, you're coming in on somebody else's project. And so they don't want you waxing critical about what they're doing. They want positive, good vibes, good energy. Let's create this thing. What do you need me to do? Sure. Oh, the 15th take? Yeah, I'd love to take this a different way. Oh my God. Oh, you know, it's like, sure, different feel. Yeah, man, tell me what you need. And, you know, like under their breath, I'm sure they're like, am I ever going to get out of here? You know, but, you know, it's like, yeah, I mean, those are the guys that get the call, and the ladies that get the call are the ones that are just like, hey, I am happy to be here. Let's just make this thing happen. So I think that's great advice, the personability of it. And the other thing I see is if you're on an intern gig, you're sitting around doing a lot of nothing sometimes. And it's so easy to tune out or to like, oh, well, nothing's going on. Let me just kind of like, what's going on? Anybody texting me or anything? And it's at that moment that something is going on, that they need a cable moved or they need a mic addressed or somebody's got to change a battery. And that's when you have an opportunity to really make an impression on somebody like, I was here, I was tuned in, I didn't blip out, even though I was sitting here for 3 hours. It's like when the moment came, I'm on it. And it's like, I want that person on the next gig because they're there, they're plugged in. And that's how you move from an intern to like an actual seat, like an actual gig. It's like, I'm gonna give you a job because you're here, you're engaged in what's going on.
It's so true. It's absolutely true. And the attitude is just, it's critical. It's the most important thing. There are lots of people that I have, you know, not hired or requested but not get hired. And there are a larger number of people that I have asked for. And in our world, in the Broadway world, that sort of, you have groups of people that sort of work together. You know, we sort of find the groups of people that we like to work with and tend to, you know, those circles expand and contract and all that. But largely, you're doing a creative project in a high stress situation, and the people that can be positive and present for it are far more valuable than the people that aren't, no matter how the talent is distributed, truly.
Yeah, Alec.
So what's your mindset like going into every time you're about to do your gig or whatnot? Because I've been told like if you walk in nervous, it keeps you, you know, more focused and ready to go. And it's happened to me in my workflow where I've been doing the same thing every day and it's gotten complacent and I do a little slip up. So what's your mindset like going to these?
That's actually a really good question. I have a history of sitting on shows for longer than a lot of people will, because I find it very interesting. I was on Jersey Boys. I mixed Jersey Boys for like 10 years, which is ridiculous. I mean, really. But I took some breaks here and there. And at first, in the beginning, when we were rewriting the show every day and then throwing it before an audience at night, I was terrified. You're just trying to remember what you need to do. And then that wears off. And that's when you enter into the danger of complacency. And for live theater sound, the variables do help keep you on your toes. And sometimes I think you have to look for them. So the weather in the room will change how the show lands. How full the house is will change how the show lands. Who's sitting in the pit that night? What understudies are on? Whether the lead guy had a fight with his wife. All of these things. And when you're hearing your show in, night after night after night, if you open up your ears, you hear those variations. It's a little bit like noticing spring happen in the desert. It's so very gradual, but it's there. And that's what I sort of try to tap into mindset-wise. So it's a little weird, but I also advocate meditation of any kind that works for you, because when things start catching on fire and you're mixing a show and you're having to troubleshoot what the problem is with your system, you still have to get the mics up at the right time. And you still have to direct somebody over radio on what to check next and tell them what the problem is. And the only way that I have found that I can do that is if I practice some kind of meditation on a regular basis to try to okay, when I'm panicking, can I find the calm in the middle of it to do what I need to do, which is get the mics up at the right time. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Have you ever ran into a disaster in the middle of a live production? And if so, how did you get through it?
Oh, yes.
Do we want to name names or keep it anonymous?
All right, well, let's go with the first one. Jersey Boys with our digitally controlled analog console. I guess this would be a good time to put that up if we have that photo, the Cadac. Yeah. So this is a picture of that console at Jersey Boys. The computer shut off. Okay, so the big black screen with the blob on it at the top is the thing that actually controls the desk. And I went through my preset one night and got to the end of it, and the main section there, let me just point to it, it'll just be easier. I almost dropped my transmitter. This little thing right here is called the CCM. It's the big brain, and the computer controls the CCM. And the CCM scrambled. It just put gibberish up. I'm like, oh, well, that's terrible. So I restarted, and it was the same. So I went to the spares kit, and I swapped the CCM out, and it scrambled. And I was like, oh, crap. So I called the guy. There's this guy, Gary Stalker, who knows Cadacs inside and out. And he's like, okay, you're screwed. You're going to have to manually map your console and mix it manually tonight. And he walked me through how to manually map it, which took a while, and we held the house. And so all of those times that I took the cues where who showed up on the faders changed, and when the cues would launch sound effects, and when the cues would change routing, didn't have that. So I mixed it manually off of all of the faders. And you can see, that's not even on the whole console, but you can see why you would want to have everything in a smaller section, because there's a bunch of faders on here. So that was the first disaster. And that's back to your question about mindset, and it's just being able to find that sort of calm place to make it happen. Even if the worst possible thing in the world is happening, you just have to keep going. Because, I mean, what was I going to do? Was I going to leave? No.
Now, how much of that did the talent, were they aware of? Like, in the
this
sense
one they were aware
like,
of absolutely all of
you
it. Yeah.
might not get that cue, like you might not hear this sound effect coming in.
We had to tell them exactly what was going on, and we were at the point where we were holding the house as well. And, we're starting the show late, and my guys backstage were awesome. They, on the fly, built this little button box to have, the doorbells and the phone rings and all that stuff. And I didn't have a way to get that into the console, So they went up to an actor, the same actor every time when I had one, and I just opened his mic up, and they'd like ring the button box in front of his microphone. And
So just like using their cell phone, just like it.
totally.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Get it
Yeah.
done.
Yeah, so they tell me you only get like one of those in a career, so I'm hoping that that's the case. It was a lot.
Will had one behind you too.
Kind of taking off on what these guys were talking about. You find yourself you're doing sound live. You find yourself in a lot of very fast paced, very high stress situations. How do you make sure that you can still be as kind of methodical, meticulous, and detail oriented as you might need to be? Because I know when I'm editing sound, or even when I'm editing video, I will go over the same cut for an hour, just because that's the kind of person I am, and that's me in my room editing. I can get away with that. How do you kind of get that level of detail, but in a live situation?
Well, the first level of that detail we're hammering out in tech rehearsals. And I'm speaking specifically to theater now. It's a team effort. It's like the whole sound department, artistic team, and all of that is working on how they want moments to land, usually as far as sound effects go and as far as how the system is dialed in. That's the main stuff that they're doing. The mix is largely left up to me, and it develops over time. The mix that I open a show with isn't as good as the mix that I'm going to have 7 weeks into the run. And that's probably not as good as the mix that I have 6 months into the run, if it runs that long. So that's a little bit of an evolution. And the sound design team really does a lot of work. So when we're in rehearsals and then we're in previews. Previews mean that you're putting up the show at night, but you're rehearsing during the day and changing things during the day. And so they're moving all over the theater to hear how things sound in different seats. They're making adjustments on, how the arrays are hitting and where they want things routed and all of that. So, it's a little bit of I think it's a little bit misleading to think that it's an apples to apples comparison as far as the level of detail that you have in the studio. Because you go through that cut, maybe you spend 4 hours on a cut. You can compare that to our, 3 weeks of tech or our 6 months of tech, depending on what show it is. And then the rest of it is prioritization. I have a checklist. I have a physical checklist for checking my system. And then I have a mental checklist of what the most important priorities are in the mix. And I'm making sure that I listen for that. Vocal clarity is the first one. And then the band is right underneath that. And that's constantly going through my mind. Can I understand these vocals? If I'm my mother, can I understand these vocals? If I'm a German tourist, can I pretty much understand these vocals? And if the composer walks in behind me, is he going to be happy with where the band is? Things like that. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Sort of.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. All right.
So you talked about like leaving your mics on and like doing that. What's the, I guess, pre-production and kind of post-production phase, if there is one, after a show that's live and held? Because I assume that there's not much editing to do.
We don't do any editing, generally speaking. Okay, here's a big change that I've been seeing lately in shows that are coming on, and it is specifically regarding Pro Tools or Ableton and what tracked components people are putting into live shows. The last show that I did, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, we had, every time the Oompa Loompas came out, we were playing a track that had their vocals on it, even though they sang live on top of it. All of this stuff is worked out in pre-production during our tech production period. And the reason that we had that track was because they were in wigs and costumes and moving scenery, and also downstage of the arrays. There was a lot of potential for feedback. And we had the same thing with On Your Feet when the cast came out in the conga line into the house. And there suddenly you've got like 20 omnidirectional mics in front of your line arrays. And that's awesome. So that's a huge new change that I've seen in Broadway, is to put these tracked components in. But that's all done in the rehearsal period. And then on a daily basis, we'll come in an hour and a half before curtain time to check the system, power the mics up, check everything, and pass it all out. And that used to be, you used to be able to get your preset done in like 20 minutes. And you could like go to the diner, get something to eat, whatever. Preset takes forever now. It's gotten so complex, and there are so many speakers to check and so many microphones to check, so many pathways to make sure are working. You know, we use all of our preset now. Usually the house manager is waiting on us to make sure that we're finished. And then at the end of the night, it's just collecting the microphones, taking the batteries out, shutting everything off.
Can you talk about how many people, so you're doing front of house sound. Do you have a separate, like A2 who's doing monitor mix on stage, in-ear mix, backstage, and then like wranglers for the wireless? And, how many people would be kind of on a Jersey Boys backstage helping you out?
It totally depends on the show. One of the scariest things that I have seen as a trend on Broadway recently is to have in-ear monitors without a dedicated monitor mixer. I think it's a terrible idea. I've seen shows that will have in-ear monitors for their cast, and then, the person who's responsible for that is also doing all this other stuff. And I think it's a real good way to damage your hearing. But typically we fight to get 2 people backstage, and you may or may not. You may get 1, you may get 2. Sometimes you get 0. Yuck. But the thing about Broadway is that we're all replaceable. So shortly after opening, we will start to, we'll train somebody backstage right away, and then train usually that backstage person on the mix. And that takes a while. That takes like 3 or 4 weeks. And it's a painful process all the way around. Just lost my train of thought there. You were asking how many people.
Just how many people, so I guess there's no typical crew, but what you aspire for and whether or not. So are you typically doing the stage mix as well as the front of house?
Yeah, we tend to have, with my designers, we usually have monitors in the wings flown. The last show that I did, we also had them in the floor because in Act 2, the set went down to this box with panels that were in front of those hanging monitors. So the only thing that the band had, or the cast had to hear the band, were these monitors in the floor. They were built into the set. And that is all run off of front of house, and those levels are automated. They're set during tech. I tend to think that it's one of the things that we don't do a great job of getting that set. It seems to get dropped to the bottom of the priority list because nobody's screaming about it. You tend to deal with the things that people are yelling about first. But then what's very common is that we do have a monitor desk backstage that is for the musicians that, again, during tech rehearsals, we set mixes that they want, but they all have personal mixers, usually Avioms and headphones. And we give them group outs, and then they can mix whatever they want to hear in their headphones. They can save them as presets. Their subs can have presets that they have saved. And that part of it usually works pretty well.
So I would think from mixing the band point of view, they're all in one place. So I haven't done musical theater. So I've done bands and I've done theater, but musical theater, I would think, so when you're mixing a live band, one of the most difficult things is getting that vocalist enough that they feel comfortable giving their vocal delivery. I can only imagine if that person was now roaming around. It's one thing when you've got floor wedges or like in-ears, and it's like, cool, don't drift to the left because you're going to feed back. So the thought that you now have this person, potentially a really dynamic singer, moving within the space, and maybe they have in-ears or maybe they don't. I mean, is everybody pretty much on in-ears at this point?
No, and I'm gonna break your soul a little bit too. There are a lot of sound designers that will not put vocals into monitors. It is a
Wow.
Broadway thing, and the place that it comes from is because initially the sound systems were just for reinforcement. And the more vocal that you put in the monitor, the more it colors your sound out front.
Sure.
And it's very noticeable because you're in small houses. You're in, say 1,200 seat houses. And let me tell you, when we had those floor monitors on Charlie, like they were a point source.
Yeah.
They sounded great, actually. But my sound designers that I work with are not that way. But there's a vast difference between what you can get out of a little MKE2 versus what you can get out of a handheld. And we dealt with that a lot on the Gloria Estafan thing. We used the practical handhelds as much as possible because it's a rock show, and that's the only way that you can get a level approaching a rock and roll level. And then she'd have to go into a ballad, and she's on her little head mic. Like, oh my God.
Wow.
And it was a challenge for the entire duration of the show to kind of balance that out. It's one of the things that we said it during tech, and then it's the mixer's problem from there on out. And it is. It is a problem, and this is all back to dealing with people and being able to have conversations with people and not take things personally, even when they're throwing things and telling you that you suck and all of that.
I would imagine, to me, it speaks to the performers as well, that
much
they're
so.
comfortable in that environment and that they can deliver these really awe-inspiring performances and they can't actually hear themselves.
Yeah, they get a lot back from the house, but
Yeah.
the difference between that and singing into a hand idol with a couple of wedges, it's those people that are comfortable with that are few and far between. Christian Borle, who played our Willy Wonka in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, he was that way. He would ask for less of himself. He would ask for more band. He was very traditional Broadway in that way, and that's rare. And I think we have to find ways to give them more. The problem with them being on in-ears is that they lose those moments with each other. And they lose, even if you have audience mics up, it's like a step removed. They can't really interact with the audience the same way. And a lot of performers want to do, oh, well, I'll just wear one. And you're like, no. It's a terrible idea. But they do.
Yeah.
They find what works for them. And I'm hoping that we find a better solution for it. I'm not really sure what it is, but it's a thing. Yeah.
Kind of again taking off of his question and your last statement there. How much do you actually have to deal with the talent of the show? Like how much are you face to face or like at the desk across the house during a sound check with the star of Jersey Boys or Gloria Estafan or whoever?
It totally depends on the show and the people that are involved in it. So I did a tour of Jesus Christ Superstar that had Carl Anderson as Judas. He's the guy who played Judas in the movie, if you've ever seen the movie. Okay, so he's been playing Judas longer than I've been alive. And he's amazing. And then we had Sebastian Bach, the lead singer of Skid Row, as Jesus. And I loved them both, and they were both insane, but they were never crazy on the same day. And my sound designer dictated when I needed to speak with them, and he wanted me to check in with both of them 3 times a show. And that was the first time that I had really been exposed to how that can mess things up. Going and asking if there's a problem invites the problems.
Now that you mention it.
So since that point, after many, many sleepless nights, I have taken a slightly less is more approach. But what I've run into more is in the production process when all of the creatives are in. I had a lot of conversations with Gloria and Emilio, and on Jersey Boys, a lot of conversations with Bob Gaudio. They were there. They're interested. They want to give their opinions, and your only job is to say yes and ask for clarification. obviously, Gloria Estafan has the final say on anything that happens in her show. And the same with Bob Gaudio. And then back to Christian Borle on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I went to his dressing room a few times throughout the run of the show just to kind of check in, but not on a daily basis. But during the tech process, he came out into the house every day and talked to every single person at every tech table, and there were a lot of them. So you take direction from your sound designer on what they want you to do. You take direction from what you're getting back from the cast. And then I always keep in mind that I'm not going to go ask if there are problems. I never ask if there are problems. I ask how things are, but.
Are there any shows that have come out recently that you just kind of stand in awe of what they're pulling off technically?
Yeah, basically anything that Cirque du Soleil does is really mind-blowing. I saw Mystère like 15 years ago or something, and that's like the low-budget Cirque, and my friend was working on it. I was like, this is going to make everything else that I ever work on look like a piece of poo, so thanks.
I had seen them a while back, and just watching, I noticed, like looking into the pit, everybody had their own little digital mixer.
Yeah.
And everybody was on headphones. And I was watching, the mixers were automated as the show is going on. So everybody is getting a customized mix as the show is progressing through.
Yeah.
I'm like, look at that. There's like 63 mixers running right now. And there's a house person doing their thing. But that's just in the pit. It was like, what's going on in there?
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't get to see The Great Comet of 1812, and I wish that I had, because sound-wise, that was really ambitious what they did. They did the whole thing in the round, and from all reports that I heard, it was really incredible. I'm really fired up about Harry Potter coming up, because I read the little script in the book, and I was like, I have no idea how they're going to pull this off. I am waiting to see. It's going to be amazing.
Can you talk a little bit about like the memorization? How do you provide notes for yourself? I mean, especially working on a show for 10 years. I mean, at that point, in one sense, it's rote. You know what's coming next, and if something doesn't come, like your radar goes off. But how do you track a mix?
Can I put these on the overhead thing?
Sure.
Is that a reasonable thing to do? So I live and die by my script.
I'm going to drop this down, much to Rod's chagrin in the back, but we'll drop down that.
When you're doing a show, you start off with a script. They give you a script, and I write. Wow.
It's a moment.
So I'm writing down the numbers of who's on what fader and any notes that I have, where the cues go, stuff like that. So this is.
Let's give it a wake up.
It's gonna wake up. Okay. The thing about new shows, starting off new shows, is that they are constantly rewriting them and giving you changes. You're hoping that they give you the changes.
How am I? There we go.
Okay, so this is the first page of the Jersey Boys script. As you can see, the day, August 12th, 2005. So these up here are my cue numbers. And then over here, I have band levels written. And it doesn't matter how you choose to do it, as long as you've got it written down so that you can follow along as you're going. And so these are indicators of who's on what fader, who's got the solo, the fact that these people are going to be loud. I don't want to bring them up as loud as I have been bringing them up. And then they get quiet on this line here. Oh, that's not on the thing. I got to make them louder here. So you're learning a new show, you have all this stuff written down, and you have to turn the pages, which is kind of a bummer. But yeah, it's just, kind of an example. This stuff all makes sense to me, and when you write it, it makes sense to you. I also put up in the corner, I put a cue number of what cue I'm in at this moment, because when you're in rehearsals, you're going to be jumping all over the place. And the last thing you want is for them to wait on sound. When we did Jersey Boys, they were using some script format. I can't remember what it is, but every time they made a change, we would get a different color of paper. So the scripts, when we ended up with them, were like rainbows. They were just, all different colors. And we got to, very bizarre color combinations at the end of it. That's sort of the basic, what that is. And then I brought a couple pages from my Charlie script as well. So just an indication that I've got the track running on a fader that I'm leaving at level throughout this whole thing. A red indicates sound effect for me. There were a lot of farts in that show. So you get the basic idea of it. When we did when we did Jersey Boys, I had to write all of these notes by hand. You can laugh at my little Post-it notes, but they all meant something. What happens in these cues? I'm taking these cues. I need to know what's happening in them, and I know. But what about the guy that comes in year 6? That person needs to know as well. Now on the SD7, we just write it in the show notes on the cue. Like there's this little window that pops up, and you can put it all in there.
There's a difference between having the cue, having a little screen on the console that's bringing you up notes, as opposed to it's handwritten. You can write yourself a little smiley face and it means something to you, as opposed to just.
Well, I still do make smiley faces. Hang on, do I have one in here? No, I have to do things to get my attention. I'll still use, this is from Charlie, I still use this because Christian ad-libbed all over the place, and I had to write notes about when to bring him up, because our habit is to completely take mics out when they're not, saying a line that's in the script. So I use those, the note window in the main cue block just to tell me what's happening there. So I've got somebody routed to, a weird routing. I'm going into this specific EQ for this point and all that. But as far as who's on what fader, what levels I need to be at, I still do pencil on paper. I still have paper. I'm still turning pages. And what I've seen with people that are doing new shows, it's still the best method to do it, because you're still going to get a stack of rewrites in the morning. You've got to update it. And it's usually not the morning. It's usually on your lunch break. They hand you this, and then you're going at 1 o'clock, and you've got to start running these changes. So you've got to be programming on the fly, and you don't have time to put it in your happy little format with your color codes and your computer. And some people like to do that, but I think for a new show, it really slows you down. It's a lot easier to just write it in there.
I got a million questions. I can talk to you forever. Go ahead.
For a actor that's ad-libbing a lot, how do you, time it or know when to bring them up?
You kind of have to have an artistic decision made about when it's going to happen. And with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Christian was very consistent about when he will do his ad-libs. So I had the little things marked in there for when to put them up, but he wouldn't always say the same thing. I mean, and he could go on and on. And then he started to add things in as we went along, and I could hear it. I could hear that if I had his mic out and he did something. So the next night, I'd put him up for that and see what he said and leave it in. But really, the director has the ultimate say over whether ad-libs are going to be allowed or not, because most directors mostly don't want them to be in the show. But for this show, it made a lot of sense. People were coming to see him in that role, and he pretty much had free reign. And sometimes it was really difficult in the Hall of Invisible Corridors, which is purely sound effects. The entire scene is sound effects. There's no set there. And it was his biggest sort of free reign ad-lib scene. And he would still give me the cue lines. So I'd have to listen for these cue lines to take all these sound effects at the right time. But he was hilarious. I couldn't drift and really get into what he was saying, because I would miss a line. So it's challenging, but somebody else has to make the decision on when it's going to happen, and then you sort of fall in line with that.
I think we got to start thinking about wrapping it up.
All right.
But maybe one last question, if anybody's got anything else. No? Was there? So I guess maybe if you could just leave us with maybe a parting word of. You've talked about, yeah. I mean, you traveled around early on when we were speaking with Mark Raz last week about radio. You know, he had even expressed, you know, listen, be willing to go where the opportunities are. Don't get too stuck. I mean, your arc that ultimately led you to Broadway. I mean, how long was your kind of professional development as you kind of took your tours? I mean, you were in Dallas, you were in Indiana, you were in Arizona.
Yeah, I kind of went all over. I went from Indiana to Dallas, to Tucson, to Phoenix, to San Diego, back to Phoenix. And then I went on the road, and I was on the road for about 5 years. You know, to the point where I didn't even keep an apartment anymore. I just had a storage unit. And it was a really, really good fit for probably about 4 of those years. And, you know, and then I wanted to be somewhere. And I think it's different for everybody. But yeah, definitely don't be afraid to go wide, you know, go where the opportunities are. And I think that the other thing is that a lot of people believe that they have to have their career path all figured out. And you absolutely don't. I think most people don't have their career paths figured out. Until you get into it, you don't know what you're interested in. I've got one of my kids is in mechanical engineering. She's finishing up her senior year, and she started off as electrical engineering, and then switched over, and she got into it, and she's like, I didn't know about hydraulics, I didn't know about air quality, and she's all fired up about air quality. And she's like, I didn't even know this was a thing. And that's the point. You don't know anything's a thing until you start studying, and then things come to you, and you start to feel where the fits are for you. So don't get too wrapped up in having your path mapped out, but when you find something that draws you in, go with that and go find out more about it. That's what I would say.
That's awesome. All right, let's thank Julie Sloan. Oh, one more. Isaiah's going to sneak one in. All right.
Do you work with interns? And if you do, like, would you expect them or wish that they take from you skill-wise?
We have worked with interns when we're putting up productions of new shows. It's probably not the best intern situation because, like you were alluding to earlier, there's a lot of sitting around. Like tech in general, there's a lot of sitting around. But the most successful interns that we have had will do, they're proficient in Pro Tools, and they can have a project passed down to them, you know, to create a sound effect or to do some editing on this to clean this thing up. They can keep track of script changes and really just kind of be present to what's needed. And in our situation for interns in production for tech, it's really kind of difficult because there is so very much downtime with it. But yeah, being present, just really being present instead of, you know, playing Candy Crush or whatever.
All right. Cool. Thank you, Julie, so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.